Evelyn Parker pressed that envelope of money back into Thomas Whitaker's hand so hard her knuckles went white. She had crossed 500 miles of American wilderness for this man. She had sold her mother's brooch to buy the dress she was wearing. She had not slept in 3 days because she was so afraid of arriving wrong, too plain, too quiet, too much of everything a frontier businessman didn't need. And now he was standing on a train platform in front of the entire town of Red Creek, Wyoming, handing her back like damaged freight. If you've ever been made to feel like you were too much and not enough at the same time, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happened next changed everything. The letter had smelled like cedar and pine. Evelyn Parker had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The ink in certain places faded from where her thumb had traced the same sentences over and over again in the dark of her rented room in Richmond, Virginia, when the loneliness got loud enough to keep her awake. A man of standing seeks a woman of character. Hard work valued above all. A home awaits the right woman. Wyoming territory. Red Creek. She had not answered the advertisement because she was desperate. She told herself that every time she felt the sting of doubt rise up through her chest. She had answered it because she was 36 years old, and she had been surviving instead of living for so long that she had almost forgotten there was a difference. Evelyn's mother had died in the winter of 1881. Her father had been gone long before that, gone in the way that men sometimes go. Not dead, just absent, choosing something else over the family that needed him. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a school teacher's aide, then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who paid her half of what he paid the man she'd replaced, and who reminded her of that fact every single time she did something worth praising. She was not a woman who broke easily. But 3 years of surviving without a single person in the world who was truly hers had worn something down inside her that she couldn't quite name. So when she read that letter, when she read the words, "A home awaits the right woman," she let herself believe it. She wrote back. She wrote carefully and honestly. She said she had no family left and no inheritance, but that she could manage a household, keep clean records, cook a proper meal, and work from before sunrise until after dark without complaint. She said she was not looking for luxury. She was looking for a life that meant something. Thomas Whitaker had written back within a month. He said she sounded exactly like what he needed. He sent enough money for the train ticket. She sold her mother's cameo brooch for the dress. And she did not sleep for 3 days on that westbound train. Not because she was too excited, but because some part of her understood, in the way that women who have been disappointed before always understand, that arriving wrong was a real possibility. Too plain, too quiet, too worn down around the edges. Too much of everything a successful businessman might decide he didn't want after all. She had pressed that fear down into a small hard place inside herself, and she had watched the American landscape change outside the window. Virginia giving way to Tennessee, giving way to the flat expanse of Missouri, and then the vast and merciless open of the territories. And she had told herself that this time was going to be different. This time, someone had chosen her. She believed that, right up until the moment the train pulled into Red Creek, Wyoming, and she stepped down onto that platform in her good blue dress with the single leather suitcase she'd owned since she was a girl. And she looked across the crowded platform and found Thomas Whitaker's eyes. And she knew. She knew before he opened his mouth. She knew from the way his face arranged itself when he saw her, not hostile, not cruel, just deeply, profoundly disappointed, the way a man looks when he opens a package and finds something other than what he ordered. How was a tall man, Thomas Whitaker. Well-dressed. The kind of man who ironed his shirt collar even out here on the frontier, who kept his boots polished and his hair combed flat. He was exactly what he had described himself to be. Respectable. Established. A man of standing. He looked at Evelyn Parker, and he saw something that didn't match what he'd built in his mind. She watched him make the decision in the space of a single breath. He was not a man who wasted time. "Miss Parker." He took one step forward, not to greet her, to be heard. "I appreciate you making the journey." "Mr. Whitaker." She kept her voice even. It's good to finally meet you in person. I need to be direct with you. He said it like he was making a business announcement to a room full of colleagues. I had certain expectations about this arrangement that I'm afraid won't be met. The platform had gone quiet around them. Not silent, the trains never fully silenced a station, but the conversations nearby had dropped away, the way they do when people sense something worth watching. Evelyn could feel it, the attention pressing in from all sides. "What kind of expectations?" she asked. "My business partners have met recently. There are certain standards when it comes to social appearances in this territory. A man in my position is expected to present himself well in all areas, including his household." He cleared his throat. "I was expecting someone different." She heard someone nearby murmur something she couldn't catch. She heard a woman's quick, hushed laugh swallowed back fast. "Different," Evelyn repeated. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience." He reached inside his jacket and produced a small envelope. "This should cover the cost of returning to Virginia, or wherever you decide to go from here." He held it out to her. She looked at it. A plain white envelope. Her passage back to nothing folded up and handed over on a train platform in front of 20 strangers. She thought about the cameo brooch. She thought about 3 days on a train with her heart in her throat. She thought about the letter that had smelled like cedar and pine, the one she had read until the paper went soft, the one that had said, "A home awaits the right woman." She thought about how long she had been made to feel like something other than the right woman. And something inside her, not anger, something older and quieter and more absolute than anger, went perfectly still. She reached out and took the envelope from his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Just one moment. Then she turned it around and pressed it back into his palm, folding his fingers over it with both of her hands, gently, the way you'd return something that had never belonged to you. "I came here as a woman looking for a future," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "Not as something you can send back when you change your mind." The platform went still in a way that had nothing to do with the trains. Thomas Whitaker stared at her. For the first time he looked uncertain. "Miss Parker, I heard you, Mr. Whitaker." She picked up her suitcase. "And I expect the whole town heard you, so let me make sure the whole town hears me too." She looked at him level and clear. "I don't know what kind of woman you were expecting, but I am the kind of woman who doesn't take money in exchange for her dignity. I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for. I hope she's worth the wait." She turned to go. She had absolutely nowhere to go. She knew that. Every step she took away from him felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff in the dark, not knowing how far the drop was. She had $7 left in her purse after the journey. She knew the name of no one in Red Creek, Wyoming. She had no return ticket. She had no plan. But she had learned something a long time ago in the particular school of hard lessons that life runs for women who have no one to protect them. Sometimes the only thing you have left is the way you carry yourself. Sometimes that has to be enough. She had made it exactly 10 steps down the platform when she heard it. A voice, low and unhurried, coming from somewhere behind the crowd. "She's not leaving." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the timbre of it, something settled and certain that cut straight through the noise and the murmuring and reached every ear on that platform without effort. Everyone turned. Evelyn turned. The man coming toward them through the crowd was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she expected. Something louder maybe, or more performative, the way men sometimes are when they're trying to make a point in public. But this man walked with the kind of quiet that belonged to someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. I was somewhere in his late 30s. Lean and weathered from years of outdoor work, with the kind of face that had been shaped by sun and wind, and the kind of long silences you only find in open country. His hat was pulled low. His coat was plain and well worn. Nothing about him shouted money, but the crowd parted for him without being asked. That told Evelyn everything she needed to know before Thomas Whitaker's face told her the rest. Because Thomas Whitaker had gone pale. The man stepped forward until he was standing in the open space between the crowd and Evelyn, facing Thomas Whitaker directly. "William." Thomas's voice had changed. The confidence had drained out of it. "This isn't your business. I'm making it my business." He didn't look at Thomas like he was angry. He looked at him the way you look at something that needs to be corrected, clear-eyed and final. "What are you doing?" "That is between me and Miss—" "I heard what it was between you and Miss Parker," William said. "So did everyone on this platform. And what I heard was a man treating a woman who traveled 1,500 miles in good faith like she was a bad investment he needed to offload." He paused. "You're better than that, Thomas. Or you used to be. I have responsibilities. You have a letter somewhere that promised a woman a home." His voice was quiet, and it was terrible in its quietness. "Whatever else you have, you've got that. And you need to think real carefully about what kind of man hands a woman an envelope and tells her to find somewhere else to be." Thomas Whitaker opened his mouth, then closed it. The crowd was absolutely silent now. William finally turned away from Thomas and looked at Evelyn. She had not moved. She was standing 10 feet away with her suitcase in her hand and her chin up and her heart hammering so loud she was certain the entire state of Wyoming could hear it. But her face was still and her eyes were steady, because she had decided she was going to be steady if it was the last thing she ever did. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Thomas had looked at her, not assessing, not calculating, not measuring her against some invisible standard she hadn't known she was supposed to meet. He just looked at her, like he was seeing a person. "Ma'am," he said. He took his hat off. "My name is William Carter. I own a ranch about 4 miles north of town. My household's been running short-handed for going on 2 years now, and the truth is, it's a mess I'm not well equipped to deal with on my own." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I'm not making you an offer of anything except honest work, fair pay, a room that's yours for as long as you want it, 3 months guaranteed, and after that the arrangement is entirely up to you." Evelyn looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" She said it plainly because she had learned that plainness was its own kind of armor. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He seemed to think about it genuinely, as if the question deserved a real answer. "Because you pushed that envelope back," he said at last. "And because somebody needed to say something, and it seemed like I was the closest one." She stared at him for another long moment. Around them the platform was still, everyone waiting to see what she would do, and she was aware of all of it. The watching, the waiting. The whispers coiled up and ready. And she was also aware that she had $7 and nowhere to go, and a suitcase that had been her mother's, and that this man had just offered her something she hadn't been offered since she got off the train. A choice. 3 months, she said. 3 months, he confirmed. "After that we renegotiate, or you go wherever you want to go. No obligation." Fair pay means what exactly? Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "Means I'll ask you what you think is fair, and then we'll agree on it before you spend a single day working." She looked at him for one more moment, then she picked up her suitcase. "All right, Mr. Carter," she said. "Show me the ranch." She did not look at Thomas Whitaker as she passed him. She heard him make a sound something between protest and indignation, but she was already moving, and William Carter was already walking beside her, and the crowd was already parting, and she did not look back. She had been made to look back enough times in her life. She was done with that particular habit. The Carter Ranch was 4 miles north of Red Creek, and the road there was nothing but hard-packed dirt and the long sweep of Wyoming sky pressing down on every side so big and so blue, it felt almost aggressive, like the land itself was reminding you of its scale and your smallness within it. William Carter drove the wagon in the easy, economical way of someone who had made this trip 10,000 times. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words, which Evelyn appreciated more than she could have explained. After the noise of the station, the quiet felt like something to breathe into. After a while he said, "You want to tell me how it happened?" "You were there," she said. "I was there for the end of it. I'm asking how it started." She looked out at the grassland rolling past. "He placed an advertisement in a Virginia paper, said he was a businessman in Wyoming territory, that he needed a woman of character to help build a proper home. Said hard work was valued above all else." She paused. "He wrote me a letter after I responded, said I sounded like exactly what he needed." But apparently what he needed changed between Virginia and Wyoming. She said it without bias, just fact. I expect there's a certain kind of woman his business partners had in mind. Younger maybe, more decorative. His business partners, William said, and something in his tone made it clear what he thought of that reasoning. I wasn't cruel, she said, because she believed in accuracy, even when accuracy didn't flatter her. He was efficient. He'd made a decision, and he communicated it, and he tried to make it financially manageable. That's the kind of man he is. She paused. It just turned out that I was the thing he was being efficient about. William was quiet for a moment. That couldn't have been easy, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. Nothing more needed to be said about it, and neither of them said anything more. The ranch came into view as they crested a long rise in the road. It was larger than she had imagined, a main house of timber and stone, weathered but solid, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals, and the sprawling infrastructure of a working cattle operation. She could see hands moving in the distance, horses being led, the specific rhythm of a place that ran on labor and routine. It was not pretty exactly, it was functional. But there was something about the scale of it, the way it sat against the land, that made it feel like something that had earned its place there. How many hands, she asked. 14. 12 full-time, 2 seasonal. Plus a cook who comes 3 days a week, but her biscuits taste like saddle leather, and the men have stopped being polite about saying so. And the household accounts. He glanced at her sideways. You want to know about the accounts before you've even seen the house. If the accounts are disorganized, the rest of the household usually reflects it, she said simply. It tells me where to start. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the accounts are a mess. I expected as much. My foreman does his best, but bookkeeping isn't his gift. What's his gift? Cattle. The man can look at 1,000 head and tell you in under 10 minutes which ones are trouble. Then he should be looking at cattle, she said, and someone else should be doing the books. He glanced at her again, and this time she was fairly certain that what she saw in his face was something that might have been relief, the particular relief of someone who had been managing something wrong for a long time and had finally heard someone say plainly what the right way was. They pulled up to the main house, and William helped her down from the wagon with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to do it without thinking, then carried her suitcase inside before she could argue about it. The interior of the house was exactly what she had predicted from the exterior, functional, clean in the basic sense that things had been swept and surfaces wiped, but utterly devoid of any sense that someone was actively caring for it. The kitchen was the worst supplies in no discernible order, a smoke-darkened ceiling that needed attention, a larder that was half full of things that didn't belong together. The common room had furniture that had been pushed to the edges of the room at some point and never moved back. There were no curtains on the windows. It was a house that had forgotten what a home felt like. She had seen it before, not always in buildings, but in people too. That particular kind of forgetting. I'll show you your room, William said. In a moment. She set her bag down and walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there looking, taking inventory. How long ago did you lose your housekeeper? 2 years. Mrs. Addison moved back east when her husband died. She'd been here since my father's time. And before she left, did she keep written records of the household accounts? She kept something. I'm not sure what state it's in. Where? He walked to a wooden cabinet against the far wall of the common room and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, 2 paper-bound record books, and a stack of loose invoices held together with a length of kitchen twine. Evelyn picked up the ledger. She opened it. She read the first 3 pages. This is actually very good, she said mostly to herself. What is her system? Mrs. Addison's system. It's logical and thorough, and if someone had kept it up after she left, you'd know exactly where you stand financially right now. She closed the ledger. Did anyone try to maintain it after she was gone? My foreman, for about 3 months. And then the spring drive started, and there wasn't time, and he figured he'd catch up later. She looked at him. He had the slightly defensive expression of a man who already knew he should have handled something differently. That's a very normal thing to happen, she said. It's also very fixable. She set the ledger on the kitchen table. I'll need 2 days to go through everything and establish where things actually stand. After that, I can set up a system that your foreman can maintain in under an hour a week, even during a drive. And then we can talk about the kitchen. The kitchen. The kitchen is the center of a working household, she said. When the kitchen is wrong, everything else goes wrong. The men don't eat properly. They don't rest properly. Morale suffers. Small problems become big problems. I've seen it before. She looked around again. But first I want to understand the scope of what needs doing. I'll start tonight if that's all right. He looked at her with that same expression she'd seen in the wagon. Something that might have been relief or respect, or some combination of both, that he hadn't yet found the right word for. Miss Parker, he said, show you to your room first, please. She almost smiled. All right, she said. Show me my room. Her room was at the back of the house with a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. It was small and plain, a bed, a washstand, a wardrobe. But the mattress was good, and the window latched properly, and there was a braided rug on the floor that someone had made by hand a long time ago. She ran her finger along the pattern of it and thought that this had been someone's home once, a real one, and that it could be again. She unpacked her suitcase carefully. She hung her second dress in the wardrobe. She set her mother's Bible on the windowsill. Then she washed her hands and face, smoothed her hair back, and went to find the accounts. William Carter came to the kitchen doorway at 9 o'clock that evening and found her sitting at the table with the ledger, both record books, and all the loose invoices spread out around her, working by lamplight with the focused, unhurried concentration of someone who had done this kind of work long enough to find a certain peace in it. You should eat something, he said. I ate at 6. The larder had enough for a proper supper, though barely. She didn't look up from the page she was reading. You're short on salt pork, and the flour situation is going to be a problem by the end of the week. Hank usually goes into town. Hank should go Thursday, she said. I'll have a proper list ready by Wednesday evening. I'll also need a few things from the hardware store if that's manageable. What kind of things? 2 sets of hooks for the kitchen. Some additional shelving if there's lumber. The kind of organizational infrastructure that makes a kitchen actually work. She turned a page. Nothing expensive, just practical. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. Of course. Why did you come here? He said it carefully, like he'd been thinking about how to phrase it for a while. Not to Wyoming. I understand that part. But when I offered you the position this afternoon, you didn't know me. You had no reason to trust that I wasn't just another version of the same problem you'd already walked away from. She considered the question. It deserved a real answer, and she gave it one. Because you took your hat off, she said. He blinked. What? When you spoke to me, you took your hat off. She looked back down at the ledger. Thomas Whitaker never took his hat off, not once. The whole time he was telling me I wasn't what he wanted, his hat stayed on his head. She turned another page. Small things tell you what you need to know, Mr. Carter. The small things are always more honest than the large ones. He didn't answer for a long moment. Get some rest when you reach a stopping point, he said finally. I'll have someone bring coffee in the morning. Thank you. And Miss Parker. She looked up again. What happened this afternoon, what Whitaker did, that's not how this town does things. I want you to know that. He was efficient, she said again. And honest. I'd rather have that than charm with nothing behind it. Most people wouldn't take that view. Most people haven't spent as much time as I have distinguishing between the two, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, put his hat back on, and left her to the accounts. She worked until midnight. By the time she set down her pen, she had completed a full inventory of the household financial records going back 14 months, mapped the gaps in record-keeping, identified 3 consistent overpayments to a supplier that had almost certainly been accidental, and would amount to a meaningful sum when corrected, and drafted a reorganized accounting system in a spare notebook she'd found in the cabinet. She also found something else. Something that had nothing to do with the household. It was buried in the back of the second record book behind the pages where Mrs. Addison's handwriting gave way to her foreman's rougher notations, and then to nothing at all. A set of figures that didn't match the pattern of the rest. Supply costs that didn't align with any supplier Evelyn could find in the correspondence files. Payments dated on days when, according to other records, no transactions had taken place. Small discrepancies. The kind that would be invisible unless you were looking at the whole picture at once. She looked at them for a long time. She was a woman who had kept books for a dry goods merchant for 3 years. She knew what irregular entries looked like. She knew the difference between sloppy record-keeping and deliberate concealment. These were not sloppy. She closed the record book carefully and sat very still for a moment in the lamplight. Then she opened her notebook and began to write. She was not a woman who jumped to conclusions. She was going to be certain before she said a single word. She was going to trace every figure, cross-reference every date, build a picture so complete and so undeniable that there would be no room left for doubt. It would take time. She had 3 months. It would be enough. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming night was immense and quiet. Somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle lowing and the sound of the wind moving through grass. Inside the lamp threw a circle of warm light across the table, and the open books, and her own careful handwriting filling the pages of her notebook. She was tired. She was a long way from Virginia. She had arrived in this town 8 hours ago, and already nothing was what she had expected it to be. But she had a room with a window and a braided rug that someone had made by hand, and she had $7 and a ledger that was starting to make sense to her, and she had the voice of a man who had taken his hat off when he spoke to her. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept writing. Outside in the bunkhouse, she could not have known that William Carter was sitting at the edge of his bunk in the dark hat in his hands, thinking about the woman in his kitchen who had handed a full envelope back to a man and told him in front of the entire territory exactly what she was worth. He turned his hat over once, twice. He had not intended to get involved. He had been coming out of the feed store when he heard Thomas Whitaker's voice on the platform, and something in the particular tone of it, that flat business-like certainty of a man in the middle of a transaction, had made him stop walking. And then he had seen her face, not the expression on it. He hadn't been close enough for that. He had seen the posture of her, the way she held herself absolutely still, while Thomas was talking, not brittle, not crumbling, just absorbing. The way a wall absorbs weather, taking the full force of it without moving. He had walked forward without making a decision to do it. He had spoken without planning what to say, and somehow the woman in his kitchen was the result, which was either the most sensible thing that had happened to him in years, or the beginning of something he didn't have a word for yet. He set the hat on the post at the end of the bunk. 14 months, he thought. 14 months of bad accounts and worse biscuits and an empty house that echoed when the wind came through the walls. He lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. 14 months was long enough. In the main house, Evelyn Parker blew out the lamp and made her way to her room in the dark, one hand on the wall, already memorizing the layout of this new place, the way she had learned to memorize every new place she'd ever had to make home without being asked. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hands in her lap. She thought about the figures in the back of the second record book. And then she thought about the man who had taken his hat off. And then she lay down in her clothes and stared at the ceiling of a room in Wyoming that was not her room yet, but might become it, and she let herself breathe for the first time since the train pulled into Red Creek Station. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Inside, something had already begun, quiet and certain, the way the most important things always begin. Not with declarations, not with drama. With a lamp and an open ledger and 2 people in separate rooms, thinking about the same impossible morning, and neither one of them knowing yet what it was going to become. But it had begun. And Evelyn Parker, who had learned long ago not to trust beginnings, found that her heart was doing something she had almost forgotten how to permit. It was hoping. Evelyn did not sleep past 5 o'clock. She had not slept past 5 o'clock in years. It was the kind of habit that poverty builds into a person and prosperity never quite erases. And so when the first gray light began pressing at the edges of her window, she was already dressed, already moving, already standing in the doorway of the kitchen with a lamp in one hand and her notebook in the other. The kitchen was cold. The fire had gone out overnight, and the room held the particular chill of a space that had never been properly maintained against the Wyoming mornings. She found the wood box beside the stove, found it half empty, made a note of it, and started the fire herself. She worked while the water heated. She reorganized the shelves she'd identified last night as problematic, moving the staples to the front and the seldom-used items to the back, creating a logic to the space that would make every subsequent meal faster and simpler. She found 3 jars of preserves pushed to the back of the larder that were still good. She found a sack of cornmeal that had been set on the damp stone floor and rescued what was salvageable before the rest was lost. She was making biscuits, real ones with lard cut properly into the flour, the kind her mother had taught her before her hands got too stiff to manage it, when she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. "Biscuits in about 12 minutes. A pause. Then a different voice than she expected, younger, rougher, openly surprised. "You the new housekeeper?" "I am." She pressed the dough flat with the heel of her hand. "And you're one of the ranch hands." "Hank Briggs, foreman." She heard him pour the coffee. There was a silence in which she could feel him looking at her back, reassessing. "You're up early." "The kitchen was out of order," she said. "I wanted to make a start." "Mrs. Addison used to start at 6. "Mrs. Addison apparently also kept excellent records," Evelyn said, cutting the biscuits. "I've been reading her ledgers. She was very thorough." Another pause. She could feel him tensing slightly, the specific tension of a man who had been nominally responsible for something he knew had gone to ruin. "I did my best with those after she left," he said. "I know you did," Evelyn said. And she meant it, and she said it simply enough that he'd know she meant it, and not that she was softening a criticism. "You were maintaining a cattle operation at the same time. It's too much for one person. Nobody could have kept both up properly." She slid the biscuits into the oven. Then she turned around and looked at him for the first time. How was a compact, capable-looking man in his mid-40s, with the particular weathering of someone who had spent 2 decades outdoors, and the particular wariness of someone who had learned to protect his domain from people who didn't understand it. She held out her hand. "Evelyn Parker." He looked at the offered hand for just a moment. A woman who shook hands was still unusual enough to register, then took it. His grip was firm and brief. "You were at the station yesterday," he said. "I was. I heard what happened." "Most of the town did." He looked at her steadily. "You all right?" It was such a direct, uncomplicated question that it caught her slightly off guard. She had been braced for judgment for the sideways assessment of a man deciding whether the woman his employer had brought home was going to be trouble or not. The simple human decency of the question reached her before she could put her defenses back up. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for asking." He nodded once, like that settled something. Then he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, sat down, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "Tell me how the supply runs work," she said. "Who goes how often, what authority they have to make purchases." "I go. First and third Thursday of the month. I've got a line of credit at Dunbar's store and at the feed merchant on Mill Street. And the orders, are they written down in advance, or do you work from memory?" He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Memory, mostly. And when something gets forgotten, we make do." She nodded slowly. "I'll have a written list ready for you by Wednesday evening. Going forward, the list will come from me. If there's something the men need that isn't on it, you add it and you tell me why, so I can factor it in next time." He looked at her with the expression of a man being handed something he hadn't expected to want. "That would actually help considerably," he said. "Good." She turned back to the oven. "The biscuits will be ready in 7 minutes. Are the men eating at the house or in the bunkhouse?" "Bunkhouse usually. Mrs. Addison used to have them in on Sundays." "Starting tomorrow," Evelyn said. "They eat at the house, all of them." A silence. "Ma'am," Hank said carefully, "there are 12 of them." "I know," she said. "I'll need 2 more pots and a longer serving board. Add those to Thursday's list." He stared at her back for a moment. Then she heard him make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but something honest in between the two. "Yes, ma'am," he said. William came in at 6:30. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment. She could feel him stopped, though she didn't turn around, and then he walked to the table and poured himself coffee and sat down. "You made biscuits," he said. "I did." Hank said they were... He stopped. He said they were good. She set a plate in front of him without being asked. He said they were the best biscuits he'd eaten since his mother's, William said carefully, and I believe he said it with some degree of emotion. He's been eating the cook's biscuits for 2 years, she said. The bar was not high. He looked at the biscuit. He looked at her. There was something in his face she couldn't quite classify. Not amusement exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. Something warm and unguarded. "I need to go over the account books with you this morning," she said, sitting down across from him with her own coffee and her notebook. "There are a few things I want to show you." His expression shifted. "What kind of things?" "Irregularities," she said simply. "I want to walk you through them carefully before we draw any conclusions, because I may be missing context." She opened the notebook to the page she'd marked. Here, starting in March of last year. She watched his face as he read. She had become very good at reading people's faces while they read. She watched for the moment the numbers stopped being abstract and started being real when the mind stops processing data and starts understanding consequence. It happened at the third line. His jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. "These payments," he said. "2." He stopped. "Read the supplier name again." "I don't recognize this supplier." "Neither do I. And I've been through all the correspondence files. There's no contract, no negotiation, no invoice. Just the payments." "How much?" She told him the total. He sat very still. It was a significant sum. Not ruinous, not yet, but significant, and more important than the amount was what it implied. Someone with access to the Carter Ranch accounts had been redirecting funds to a company that, as far as Evelyn could establish, did not actually exist. "This started in March," he said. "Who had access to the accounts in March?" "That's what I need you to tell me," she said. "Because I don't know your operation well enough yet. I can tell you what the records show. I can't tell you who had the opportunity." He looked at the notebook page for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "How did you find this?" he said. "Hank had those books for 14 months and he didn't." "Hank was looking at each entry individually," she said. "He was trying to maintain the record as he went. I came to it fresh so I could look at the whole picture at once. Patterns show up differently when you see the whole thing together." She paused. "It's not a criticism of Hank. He was doing the best he could with more than he had." William sat back in his chair. He looked like a man who had just discovered a crack in a wall he'd believed was solid, not panicked, not yet, but rearranging everything he thought he knew about the structure. "I need to think about who to trust with this information," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "You do. And until you've done that thinking, I'd suggest we not discuss it with anyone else." He looked at her. "You've been here less than 24 hours. "I know." "And you're already—" He stopped. "Why?" "Because it's my job," she said. "And because someone should have found it sooner, and the fact that they didn't concerns me." She closed the notebook. "Also because you took your hat off." He blinked. "Yesterday," she said. "At the station. When you spoke to me, you took your hat off. It told me something about you." She stood and took her plate to the basin. "Eat your breakfast, Mr. Carter. We can talk more after you've thought about who else might have seen these records." He looked at the biscuit. Then he looked at the kitchen, the reorganized shelves, the proper fire, the ordered surfaces, and then at the doorway where she had already gone. He ate the biscuit. It was in fact the best thing he'd eaten since he couldn't remember when. The morning passed in work, and the afternoon passed in more work, and Evelyn let it happen around her and moved through it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned to establish herself quickly in unfamiliar places. She was not performing competence. She was simply competent in the unremarkable, steady way of someone who had needed to be for a very long time. She fixed the smoke situation in the kitchen by midday, a simple flue adjustment, the kind of thing that seems obvious once you know where to look, and that causes daily misery until someone bothers to look. She reorganized the larder completely, labeling every container with a piece of muslin and a charcoal pencil so that anyone, regardless of whether they could read, could find what they needed by the shapes she'd drawn. She made a complete inventory and began the supply list for Thursday. At 3 o'clock, one of the younger ranch hands, a boy of maybe 17 named Cody, who had been lurking around the edges of the kitchen since morning with the obvious intention of being somewhere he might get something to eat, finally came to the doorway and said, "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said, not looking up from the inventory. "We heard, some of the men were wondering." He stopped, recalibrated. "They said you came in on the train yesterday, from back east." "Virginia," she said. "And that Whitaker." He stopped again, clearly uncertain of the appropriate thing to say about his employer's business associate. "He changed his mind about the arrangement," Evelyn said evenly. "These things happen." "That ain't right," Cody said, with the simple moral certainty of someone too young to have learned to qualify his outrage. "What he did. That ain't how you treat a woman who came all that way." She looked at him. He had gone slightly red, as though he'd surprised himself with his own directness. "No," she said. "It isn't. But I'm here now. That's what matters." She handed him a warm corn cake from the pan she'd made for the afternoon. "Don't spoil your supper." I took it with both hands, like she'd given him something precious, which maybe she had. She knew what it meant to receive something unexpectedly from someone who didn't have to give it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." "Cody." He stopped in the doorway. "The smoke hook on the bunkhouse stove, is it working properly?" He looked surprised. She knew there was a smoke hook. "It sticks some. Hank said he'd get to it." "Tell Hank I'll add the hardware to Thursday's list," she said. "In the meantime, make sure the men are keeping the door cracked when the stove's running. Cold air is better than smoke." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "They're going to like having you here," he said, and then he turned and went before she could respond. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment after he left. She pressed her hands flat on the wood surface. She had not expected to feel anything today, beyond the dense, focused satisfaction of useful work. She had thought she was past the point where small kindnesses landed anywhere. She was wrong. She breathed out slowly and went back to the inventory. William found her in his study at 4 o'clock. She had not gone in there without permission. She had asked Hank where the remainder of the financial documents were kept, and Hank had told her the study, and she had gone to William first, and he had said yes before she'd finished the question. He came in now and found her sitting on the floor in front of his desk, with the contents of the bottom drawer spread around her in careful stacks. Each stack labeled with a strip of paper she'd pinned to the floor with a spare button from her pocket. He stood in the doorway and looked at the organized chaos of his own financial history laid out across his study floor. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "Richard Blackwell." He said the name like he was picking up something he knew might have thorns. "Do you know who that is?" She looked up. "I've seen the name in the correspondence files. A letter from about 8 months ago. Something about an offer on the northern pastures." "He's been trying to buy my land for 3 years, William said. He walked in and stood near the desk, looking down at the organized stacks. "He owns the Blackwell Timber Concern and most of the eastern water rights in this county. He wants the Carter land because it sits between his 2 largest holdings." "And you won't sell?" "My grandfather built this ranch. My father worked it until he died. I'm not selling to a man who's spent 10 years buying up everything around him and calling it progress." He paused. "Blackwell doesn't take refusals well." Evelyn was very still. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "the payments in the record book, the ones to the non-existent supplier." "Yes," he said. "Do you know when you first refused Blackwell's offer?" A silence. He bent down and picked up the letter from Blackwell she'd set in one of the stacks. He read the date. He looked at the dates in the notebook she'd left open on the desk. The first payment to the non-existent supplier was dated 3 weeks after William's written refusal of Blackwell's offer. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. "This is what you didn't want to say until you were certain," William said. "I'm still not certain," she said. "I don't have proof of a connection. All I have is a pattern and a timeline that coincide in a way I find troubling." She looked up at him. Who has access to this study? Me, Hank, and my lawyer when he comes for the quarterly accounts. He paused. And until last year, a man named Dennis Cole, who handled my correspondence. What happened to Dennis Cole? He left. Said he had a better offer in Cheyenne. William's voice was careful. Too careful. When did he leave? February, William said. Last year. She looked back at the notebook. The first irregular payment was dated March, 1 month after Dennis Cole left. Did Blackwell's people ever have contact with Cole while he was here? She asked. I don't know, William said. And the way he said it, not like a man who didn't have the information, but like a man realizing for the first time that he should have been asking this question a year ago, told her everything about how completely he had trusted the people around him. She stood up. We need more information before we move, she said. We need to find out whether Cole went to Cheyenne or somewhere else. We need to find out if there's any connection between Cole and the supplier name on those payments. And we need to do all of that quietly, because if Blackwell knows we're looking, he'll accelerate, William said. Yes. She met his eyes. Is there someone you trust completely? Someone outside the ranch who has connections Blackwell wouldn't think to watch? I thought for a moment. Judge Harlan. He's been on the bench here for 20 years. He has no love for Blackwell. Blackwell tried to challenge one of his rulings about 3 years back publicly. It was not a gracious attempt. Can you get word to him discreetly? I can ride out there myself tomorrow. She nodded. Then something occurred to her. Don't tell anyone where you're going. He looked at her with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something warmer. You're very good at this, he said. I've been keeping accounts and paying attention to people my whole life, she said simply. This is what it looks like. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn. It was the first time he had used her name, and it landed differently than she expected. Not too familiar, not presumptuous, just honest. Like the name itself was a thing he was being careful with. I want you to know that whatever you found in those records, that's not a small thing. Most people would have cataloged what they could see and left the anomalies alone. They're not their business. Someone was stealing from you, she said, and using the money to help someone else take your home. She picked up her notebook. That became my business the moment I saw it. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. Because it's wrong, she said, and then quietly, and because this place deserves better than what someone like Blackwell would make of it. She went back to her organizing. He stood there for another moment, looking at the top of her head, bent over his financial records, and he felt something move through him that he had been careful not to feel for a very long time. He left before it could find a name. Dinner that night was the first real meal the Carter Ranch kitchen had produced in longer than anyone could accurately remember. She had made a proper stew with the salt pork and the last of the winter vegetables biscuits again, because she had flour enough and a simple ginger cake from a recipe she carried in her head that her mother had taught her before everything got hard. She did not expect what happened. Hank brought the men in from the bunkhouse, not all of them, just the 4 who were closest by the others, having eaten in the bunkhouse, and they came in with their hats off and their faces washed, and they sat down at that big empty table that had been sitting in an empty house for 2 years, and Evelyn set the food in front of them. And they were quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, the other kind. The kind that falls over people when they're handed something they forgot how to receive. Cody, who was sitting at the far end, took one bite of the stew and put his spoon down and said very quietly to no one in particular, "That tastes like home." Nobody laughed at him for it. Evelyn was at the stove when she heard it, and she kept her back to the room because her throat had done something she wasn't prepared for. William was sitting at the head of the table. She could feel that he was watching her. She stirred the pot she didn't need to stir and waited until she had her face under control. It was just stew. It was just biscuits. It was just a kitchen that worked and a table with people around it. But she understood. She had always understood in a way that she'd never quite been able to explain to anyone that this was what a home was made of. Not the building, not the furniture. This. The smell of something warm. The sound of someone young saying that tastes like home without embarrassment. She had been trying to find somewhere this existed for years. It had never occurred to her that she might be the one who made it. After dinner, she was washing up alone in the kitchen when William appeared in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold the way he did, as if he were waiting for permission. "Leave the rest," he said. "You've been at this since before 5 o'clock. I'm almost done." "Evelyn." She stopped. She turned around. Howe was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded, and he was looking at her with the expression she was starting to learn was his direct and slightly careful, like a man who had taught himself to measure things precisely before he committed to them. "Hank said something to me tonight," he said, "after supper." "What did he say?" "He said, and I'm telling you exactly what he said, that in 14 months of struggling with those account books, he found the work so disheartening that he'd started to think maybe the ranch wasn't going to make it." He paused. "And that today, after talking with you this morning, was the first day since Mrs. Addison left that he felt like things were going to be all right." She looked at him. "He's been carrying that alone," she said. "That's a heavy thing to carry." "I know." Something in William's voice shifted, something quieter, something he wasn't entirely used to saying. "I should have seen it. I've been so focused on the cattle side of things that I stopped paying attention to what was happening to the people inside this house." "You run a large operation," she said. "You can't see everything." "I should have seen that." She dried her hands on the cloth and looked at him steadily. "You're seeing it now. That's what counts." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm glad you pushed that envelope back," he said. She felt the words land in the specific tender place she'd been keeping closed since the station. The place that still ached when she pressed on it. "So am I," she said. And she meant it. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she meant it without reservation. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been properly settled between them. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Mr. Carter." He pushed off the doorframe and was gone. She stood at the kitchen basin in the quiet house and listened to the sound of him walking away. Then she looked around the kitchen, the ordered shelves, the clean surfaces, the warm residue of the evening's cooking. Still in the air, and she said nothing at all, because there was nothing adequate to say to a house that had just started very slowly to feel like somewhere she might belong. She had been here 36 hours. She had no business feeling any of this so soon. She felt it anyway. She blew out the lamp and went to her room in the dark, and she lay down on the narrow bed, and outside the window, Wyoming was enormous and cold and full of stars, and somewhere out there in that darkness, she was almost certain a man named Blackwell was watching the Carter Ranch and waiting for it to fail. And underneath that certainty, like a coal still hot under ash, someone inside this ranch, someone who had sat at that table or walked those floors or been trusted with those records had helped him. She lay still and let that fact take shape in the darkness. She was not afraid of it. She was, if anything, sharper for it, the way cold air sharpens a mind that wants to go dull. She had 3 months. She was going to need every single day of them. She closed her eyes. She was asleep before the thought finished forming, and she did not dream. And when the gray light came back to the window in the morning, she was already awake, already reaching for her notebook, already thinking about what came next. Because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough. 3 weeks into her time at Carter Ranch, Evelyn had developed a habit that William noticed before she did. Every morning without fail, she was the first one in the kitchen. Every evening without fail, she was the last one to leave it. And in between those two fixed points, she moved through the ranch like water, finding its level, quiet, purposeful, getting into every crack and corner and low place that had been ignored for too long, filling it up, making it right. The men had stopped being cautious around her by the end of the first week. That was the thing William noticed most. His ranch hands were not delicate men. They were hard-weathered, plain-spoken, accustomed to a life that didn't make room for sentiment. And yet, within 7 days of Evelyn Parker's arrival, Cody had started combing his hair before dinner, and old Pete Marsh, who had not spoken a complete sentence indoors since Mrs. Addison left, had started saying thank you every time she set a plate in front of him. Every single time. like he was practicing it, like someone had reminded him it was possible. William had watched all of it from a careful distance. He was a man who trusted what he could observe, and what he observed in those first weeks was this. Evelyn Parker did not try to make people like her. She simply treated them as though they mattered consistently and without performance. And the result was that people could not help but orient toward her the way a cold room orients toward a fire. He was not immune to it. He was in fact significantly less immune to it than he had expected, and that fact occupied a corner of his mind with increasing persistence in a way he was not entirely sure how to manage. But there were more urgent things to manage. There were always more urgent things. He had ridden out to Judge Harlan's place on a Tuesday morning alone, telling Hank he was checking the fence line on the north quarter, which was partially true and entirely not the point. He had been back by mid-afternoon, and he had said nothing to anyone until after dinner that night, when he found Evelyn at the kitchen table with her notebook and sat down across from her and said without preamble, "Harlan confirmed it." She looked up immediately. "Confirmed what specifically?" "Dennis Cole didn't go to Cheyenne." William put his hat on the table. "He's been working for a land management company out of Laramie, a company Harlan says is wholly owned by Richard Blackwell under a different name." She was very still. "Since when?" she asked. "Since January, 1 month before he gave his notice here." She set her pen down. She looked at the notebook page in front of her, the one she'd been using to track the payment discrepancies, and then she looked up at him and said, "He didn't leave William. He was extracted." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them acknowledged it. The information was too large for that. "Extracted," he repeated. "Placed here, given time to establish himself, learn the operation, understand the accounts, and then moved out before anything could be discovered, with enough groundwork laid to start bleeding the ranch from a distance." She tapped the notebook page. "That's what these payments are. They're not theft exactly. They're sabotage designed to look like mismanagement. Enough financial pressure sustained long enough, and you'd either have to sell or default." William looked at the notebook page. His jaw was tight. "Blackwell's been doing them," he said. "To how many ranches?" "I don't know, but Harlan might." Harlan said he's had suspicions about 3 other property transfers in this county over the last 4 years. William's voice was controlled and very quiet. "Ranches that sold suddenly. Owners who said they were struggling and didn't want to say why." He paused. "One of those owners was a friend of my father's." The kitchen was still. "William." Evelyn said his name again, and this time they both heard it, and she didn't pull it back. "How long before Blackwell realizes the payments stopped being processed?" He looked at her sharply. "They stopped. I stopped approving them 8 days ago," she said. "I rerouted the amounts into a holding record and wrote the payments as pending rather than processed. It would look like an administrative backlog to anyone who wasn't examining closely." She paused. "But if Blackwell has someone still watching the accounts from outside?" "He'll notice soon," William said, "if he hasn't already. Then we're working on a shorter timeline than I thought." She turned to a fresh page in the notebook. "We need documentation. Everything we have organized clearly enough that a judge can follow it without us explaining every step. Harlan, can he receive evidence without it becoming public record immediately?" "He's a careful man." "That's not what I asked." William almost smiled despite himself. "Yes, he can receive it privately." "Good. I need 2 more days to finish the documentation. Everything traced, everything cross-referenced, every discrepancy mapped back to a date and a corresponding Blackwell Company action." She was already writing. "I'll work nights." "Evelyn." "I'm not tired," she said before he could finish. "I was going to say thank you," he said. She stopped writing. She looked up at him, and she found him looking at her with that expression she'd been learning, the one that was direct and slightly careful. And underneath those 2 things, something she didn't yet have a name for. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "This is what I'm here for." "No," he said. "It isn't. What you're here for is running my household. What you're doing is protecting my ranch." He held her gaze. "Those are different things. And you've been doing both." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she looked back at her notebook. "Go to sleep, Mr. Carter," she said. "Let me work." He picked up his hat from the table. He stood. He paused. "William," he said. She looked up. "You called me William twice tonight," he said. "I think we're past Mr. Carter." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then, "Good night, William." "Good night, Evelyn." She listened to him leave, and then she sat very still for exactly 5 seconds, which was as long as she permitted herself. Then she picked up her pen and got back to work. She was 3 pages into the second night's documentation when she heard the writer. She would not have known to pay attention to it under normal circumstances. Horses moved around ranches at all hours, especially during calving season. But something about the timing of it. The single horse moving fast on the north road, well past midnight, made her set her pen down and go to the window. She couldn't see much in the darkness. Just the movement of something crossing the distant fence line. Going away from the ranch, not toward it. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she went back to her notebook and wrote down the time. She mentioned it to William at breakfast, casually, while she was refilling his coffee. She said she'd heard a horse on the north road around midnight and hadn't recognized the pace. He stopped chewing. "Which direction?" "East," she said. "Moving fast, away from the ranch." He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "That's the road toward the Blackwell timber holding." She said nothing. He set his fork down. "Who was working last night?" "Cody and 2 others on night rotation," she said. "I haven't asked them anything." "Don't." He stood. "Let me talk to Hank." "William." He stopped. "If someone on your crew is reporting to Blackwell." "I know." "Then they already know we're aware of the payments," she said. "The moment the approvals stopped, whoever is watching the accounts from inside." "I know," he said again, and his voice had gone somewhere very controlled and very tight. "You need to move faster than you planned," she said. "I'll have the documentation to Harlan by tomorrow. Not 2 days. Tomorrow." He looked at her. "You'd work through the night." "I have before," she said. "This is more important than sleep." Something moved through his face, a complicated mixture of things she couldn't fully read. "I'll have Hank double the night rotation," he said, "and I'll post someone on the north road." He picked up his hat. "Don't work alone after dark." "I'll be in the kitchen." "I mean it." He held her gaze. "If Blackwell knows we're looking, if there's someone in this operation feeding him information, then you're a variable he didn't account for. He'll want to remove that variable." She felt the meaning of that settle into her bones. "I'm not leaving," she said. His jaw tightened. "I know you're not. And I'm not stopping the documentation." "I know that too." He said it with the particular exasperation of a man who has just realized that the most capable and most obstinate person he has ever met are the same person. "So just don't be alone, please." She nodded once. He left. She went back to the table and picked up her pen, and her hand was entirely steady, and she was quite proud of that. She worked through the morning and most of the afternoon, pausing only to manage the kitchen, because the household ran, regardless of what else was happening, and she was not the kind of woman who let the urgent swallow the necessary. Cody came in for the afternoon meal, and she watched him while he ate, looking for something she couldn't name yet, some trace of guilt or evasion, or the particular over-casualness of someone performing innocence. She found nothing, but she hadn't found it in Dennis Cole either, presumably, and he had spent a year in this house dismantling it from the inside. That thought sat with her like a stone. It was Hank who came to her at 4 o'clock, not William. He came into the kitchen and closed the door behind him, which he had never done before, and stood there with his hat in his hands, looking like a man carrying something that was too heavy to put down, but too dangerous to keep holding. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He turned his hat over once, twice. "Last night," he said. "The horse on the north road." She waited. It was Pete Marsh. The name landed like a stone in still water. Pete Marsh. Old Pete, who said thank you every single time she set a plate in front of him. Pete, who had been on the Carter Ranch for 11 years. Pete, who William had mentioned with the particular offhand trust of someone whose presence had become so familiar it was practically invisible. "You're certain," she said. "I talked to Cody this morning." Cody said Pete came back at 2 in the morning and told him to forget he'd seen him go, said it was personal business. Hank's voice was heavy. Pete's never had personal business in the 11 years I've known him. Does William know? I came to you first. She looked at him. Why? Because you're the one who's going to know what to do with it, he said simply. And because I didn't want William to hear it from me and do something fast. He loved that old man like... He stopped, looked at the table. He helped raise William after his daddy got sick. Pete's been here since William was 12 years old. The weight of that sat between them. You did right coming to me, she said. Don't say anything to Pete. Don't change your behavior toward him at all. Go about today exactly as you normally would. And Pete? Let him go about his day too. She closed her notebook. I need to talk to William before we do anything else. And Hank, this stays between us until I do. He nodded. He stood. At the door he turned back. He might not have had a choice, Hank said. Blackwell the man has ways of making things difficult. If he had something on Pete. Something from Pete's past, something. I know, Evelyn said quietly. People do terrible things when they're cornered. She understood that. She understood it in her bones. That doesn't make it right, Hank said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She found William in the north pasture, and she was glad the walk gave her time to think, because what she had to say needed to be said carefully, and she was not sure she had ever told someone something this painful in her life. She walked out to where he was talking to one of the hands about the fence repair, and she waited at a distance that told him without words that she needed to speak to him alone, and he read it. She had noticed that he was very good at reading her, and dismissed the hand within 2 minutes. He walked toward her. He saw her face before she spoke. Tell me, he said. She told him. She watched it go through him, the way a cold wave goes through a man who expected warmth. The initial stillness, the breath, then something deep beneath the surface that moved before his face had time to arrange itself against it. Pete, he said. Just the name, nothing else. Hank is certain, Cody confirmed it. William turned away. He stood with his back to her, and she let him have the privacy of not being watched while he took something apart inside himself. She waited. When he turned back, his face was steady and very closed. How long? I don't know. But if he's the one who's been watching the accounts and reporting back, it could be from the beginning, from when the payments first started. So Blackwell didn't use Cole to watch. He used Cole to set it up. William's voice was flat. And Pete to maintain it. That's what I think. Cole was never meant to stay. He was placed here to build the mechanism. Pete was already here, already trusted. She paused. William, is there anything in Pete's past that Blackwell could have used against him? A long silence. Pete was in Texas before he came here, William said. He never talked about it much. I knew there was something, a debt he was running from, I always assumed. I never pressed him on it. He stopped. I should have pressed him on it. You trusted him, she said. That's not a failing. It is when it costs you your home. It hasn't cost you your home, she said. Not yet. And it won't. She waited until he looked at her. But I need to know, what do you want to do? I was quiet for a long moment. I want to talk to him, William said. That could be dangerous. If Pete knows we know, he'll tell Blackwell immediately. I know that. His voice was steady. I'm going to talk to him anyway. She looked at him. Then let me be there. Evelyn. Let me be there, she said again. Because you're going to be angry, and angry men sometimes say less than they should and hear less than they need to. I'll be there to hear what you miss. He looked at her for a long moment. Fine, he said. Tonight, after supper. She nodded. She turned to go. Evelyn. She stopped. I need you to know something. She turned back. He was looking at her with that expression again, direct and careful, and underneath everything else, something that she kept being surprised by. Whatever happens tonight, whatever comes out of this, you finding that discrepancy in the accounts, you did that. Not me. If you hadn't, we don't know what might have happened, she said. There's no use in that kind of thinking. No, he said. But there's use in saying thank you to the right person. She looked at him. Something had been building in her chest for 3 weeks. Something she had been firmly and sensibly refusing to acknowledge. And it chose this specific moment in a cold pasture in Wyoming, with the smell of cattle and grass and winter on the air, to become very difficult to ignore. "You're welcome," she said. And then she walked back to the house before her face could say anything her mouth hadn't decided on yet. Supper that night was the longest meal she had ever supervised. Pete Marsh sat at his usual place at the table and said thank you when she set his plate down, and she looked at the top of his weathered head and felt something so complicated she couldn't have named it. Fury and sorrow, and something that was almost pity. Because Hank was right. People in corners did desperate things, and this man had been in some kind of corner for years. She watched his hands while he ate. They were steady. That was almost worse somehow. After the meal, William asked Pete to stay behind. He said it quietly without particular inflection, and Pete looked up with the particular look of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and has just heard it arrive. The other men filed out. Hank stayed near the door without being asked. Evelyn stayed at the kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, as if she were still working. William sat down across from Pete. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the man across from him, the way you look at something you loved that has changed into something you don't recognize. Pete broke first. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," William said. "Tell me why." Pete put his hands on the table and looked at them. His fingers were thick and crooked from years of work, and they lay there on the scarred wood like something that belonged to a different story. "My boy," he said. "In Texas. He got himself into something bad. A debt to someone who—" He stopped. "Blackwell's man came to me 2 years ago. Said my son would be safe if I helped. Said if I didn't, he wouldn't." He paused. I thought—" He stopped again. "You thought you were protecting your son," William said. "I thought I'd do it just long enough to buy time, find another way." Pete's voice was fraying at the edges. There wasn't another way, and then it was too far in to stop. William was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather built this ranch," he said. "My father worked it sick. I have 14 men who depend on what happens here." He paused. "And you've been helping a man try to take it." "I know." Pete's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know what I did. Is your son safe right now? Is he safe?" Pete looked up, startled by the question. "As far as I know," he said. "What does Blackwell's man know about your son, specifically name, location? His name, where he lives, that's enough." "I need that name," William said. "And where he lives." Pete stared at him. "Why?" "Because if Blackwell's people can find him, so can Judge Harlan," William said. "And Harlan can make sure your son has protection that doesn't depend on you betraying anyone." The silence that followed was so complete that Evelyn could hear the wind against the windows. Pete Marsh put his face in his hands. She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for anger, for denial, for the cornered defiance of a man who had nothing left to protect. She had not prepared herself for the particular broken sound that came from a person who has been carrying something unbearable alone for 2 years and has finally, without warning, been offered a way to set it down. She looked at William, who was watching Pete with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not softness, not quite, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. The specific kind of empathy that costs something to give. After a long moment, Pete looked up. "I'll give you everything," he said. "Everything I passed to them. Every account I accessed, every conversation I reported. Everything." He looked at William directly. "I know what it cost you to sit here and ask me instead of—" He stopped. "You're a better man than me." "You were in a corner," William said. "I've never been in the corner you were in. I don't know what I'd do." He paused. "But Pete, you should have told me. 2 years ago. I would have helped." Pete closed his eyes. "I know that," he said. "I know that now." Evelyn wrote the son's name and location in her notebook as Pete gave them, and she wrote down everything else he said, and she did not look up from the page, because if she looked up from the page, she was going to have trouble with her face, and now was not the time for that. Pete stayed at the ranch that night with Hank's silent understanding that he wasn't to leave the property. There was no cruelty in it. There was just the simple, sad mechanics of a situation that had moved beyond anyone's comfort. William came to the kitchen after Pete had gone to the bunkhouse. He sat down at the table without being asked, without preamble, and put his head in his hands the way a man does when he is finally privately in a safe enough place to be undone. She got up and made coffee. She set a cup beside his elbow without a word. After a while he lifted his head. "I knew something was off with that man for a year," he said. "I looked at him sometimes, and I thought he looks tired in a way that isn't about cattle. And I told myself I was imagining it." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I should have asked." "People don't ask those questions," she said. "It feels like intrusion." "It feels like intrusion," he said. "And then it becomes this." He looked at the table. "Blackwell has been running this scheme on ranches all over this county, and I have been sitting here watching my land and my cattle and not watching the people." "You're watching them now," she said, "because you made me." "I didn't make you do anything," she said. "I showed you something in the account books. What you did after that, how you handled Pete tonight, what you said to him, that was you. That had nothing to do with me." He looked at her. "You could have been angry," she said. "You had every right. 11 years. He knew you since you were 12 years old, and he was passing your accounts to the man trying to take everything you have." She held his gaze. "And instead of that, you asked if his son was safe. Before anything else. Before the anger, before the accusation, before—" She stopped. He was watching her. "I notice things," she said more quietly. "It's what I do. And what I'm telling you is that what I noticed tonight was a good man." The kitchen was very still. Outside, Wyoming was enormous and dark and cold. Inside, the lamp burned warm and steady, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then William said quietly, "Evelyn, can I ask you something?" "Yes, when your 3 months are up." He stopped. "Then, I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I just need to know whether you've thought about it." She looked at him. "I've thought about it," she said carefully. "And—" She looked at the notebook in front of her, at the pages of careful, precise work that had saved a ranch and uncovered a scheme, and somewhere in the margins of all of it had started to feel like something more than employment. "Ask me again when Blackwell has been dealt with," she said. "I don't think it's right to answer that question while we're still in the middle of all this." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a fair answer," he said. "It's an honest one." "Fair and honest tend to be the same thing with you," he said. There was something warm in it, something that was not quite teasing and not quite tenderness, but lived exactly between the two. She looked down at her notebook before her face could embarrass her. "Good night, William," she said. He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused. "The documentation for Harlan," he said. "I'll write out first thing tomorrow." "It'll be ready," she said. He nodded. She heard him walk down the hall. She heard the front door open and close. She sat at the table in the lamplight, and she thought about Blackwell, who was somewhere out there tonight probably sleeping soundly, because he believed he was still winning. And she thought about Pete Marsh, who was somewhere out there tonight, probably not sleeping at all. And she thought about the expression on William Carter's face when he had asked Pete if his son was safe before he asked anything else. She thought about what it meant to be a person like that. She thought about what it meant to have found one. Then she closed her notebook, set her pen down straight beside it, and blew out the lamp. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we move, and Blackwell would not see it coming. He had planned against a struggling ranch with disorganized accounts and no one paying close enough attention. He had not planned for a woman from Virginia who had read Mrs. Addison's ledgers by lamplight on her first night in Wyoming and found the thread that unraveled everything. He had not planned for Evelyn Parker. That she thought in the last moment before she closed her eyes was going to be his most costly mistake. William left for Judge Harlan's before sunrise. Evelyn heard him go. She had been awake already, sitting at the kitchen table with the completed documentation in front of her. 41 pages of cross-referenced records, payment discrepancies, mapped by date, supplier names, traced back to Blackwell's shell company. Pete Marsh's full written account that he had signed with a hand that shook only slightly. She had worked until 3 in the morning to finish it, and she was not tired in any way that mattered, because the particular energy of a thing finally done had its own kind of fuel. She heard William's horse on the road moving north, and she sat with her coffee and listened until the sound was gone. Then she looked at the empty kitchen and thought, today is the day it changes. She did not know exactly what that would look like. She knew what she had built, a case so complete and so clearly documented that Judge Harlan would have everything he needed to act. She knew what William was riding toward. But knowing the shape of something and living through it were always different things, and she had learned not to mistake preparation for certainty. She made breakfast. She made it well. She made it the way she made everything in this kitchen, with the full weight of her attention, because she had found that the fastest way to make a home was to treat every ordinary act as though it mattered, because it did. Cody came in first, as he usually did, and he looked at her face with the particular acuity of a 17-year-old who had been paying close attention for 3 weeks, and said without any greeting at all, something happened. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "Miss Evelyn." "Cody." She set the plate in front of him. "What happens today is going to happen whether you worry about it or not. So eat and do your work, and trust that things are moving in the right direction." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork. "You're not scared," he said, as if this were a fact he was confirming. "I didn't say that," she said. "You don't look scared. Scared and showing it are different things." She sat down across from him with her own coffee. "Your job today is to be exactly as normal as you can manage. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She looked at him steadily. "And Cody Pete is going to be at breakfast, and he's going to look like a man who barely slept. Don't make it harder for him than it already is." Cody was quiet for a moment. "What he did was wrong," she said. "And also desperate. Both things can be true." He chewed. He thought. "That's a complicated way to look at it," he said. "Most true things are," she said. He almost smiled. Then he went back to his eggs. Pete Marsh came in 20 minutes later. He looked exactly as she had predicted, the drained, hollowed look of a man who had spent the night inside his own consequences. He sat at the far end of the table, and he did not speak. And when Evelyn set his breakfast in front of him, he looked up at her with an expression so raw and so wrecked that she had to make a conscious effort to keep her own face still. "Thank you," he said. His voice was barely sound at all. "Of course," she said. "Just that. Nothing more, nothing less." She went back to the stove. She did not watch him, but she knew by the quality of the silence at the table that Cody had not looked at Pete wrong, and that Pete had noticed, and that the small mercy of it had meant something. Small things. They were always the honest ones. William rode back into the ranch yard at 10:30 with his jaw set and his horse breathing hard from being pushed, and Evelyn was in the yard with the supply list for Hank when he came through the gate. She looked at his face and knew immediately that something had happened that had not been planned for. "Inside," he said. She followed him in. He took off his hat and set it on the table and stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the wood, and she waited because she had learned that he needed a beat to organize himself before he could speak clearly when something had shaken him. "Harlan took the documentation," he said. "He read it on the spot. Said it was the cleanest case he'd seen built in 20 years. He paused. "He also told me something I didn't know." She waited. "Blackwell filed papers 3 days ago," William said. "A debt claim against the ranch." The room went still. "What debt?" she said. "That's the thing." He looked up at her. "The debt is tied to those payments in the account books. The ones to the shell company. Blackwell's position is that the ranch entered into a supply agreement with his company and defaulted on it." He paused. "He used the payments Cole set up as evidence of a contract that doesn't exist and never existed, but that looks on paper like one." She sat down. She felt the architecture of it unfold in her mind with nauseating clarity, the elegance of it, the terrible patience it represented. Cole placed here to establish the pattern of payments. Enough entries to look like an ongoing business relationship. Then Blackwell's company files a default claim, producing the payment records as evidence of a debt owed, and the ranch is caught between proving a negative and a legal process that would take long enough to bleed them dry. "I wasn't just trying to pressure you into selling," she said slowly. He was building a legal mechanism. The payments were the foundation for a false contract claim. "Yes," William said. "When was the filing dated?" 3 days ago. 3 days ago. She counted back. That was 2 days after she had stopped approving the payments. "He knew," she said. "He knew we'd stop the payments. He accelerated the whole scheme before we could build a defense." She looked at William. "Who told him Pete wouldn't have had time to—" "Not Pete," William said. "Harlan said the filing came from Cheyenne, Blackwell himself, which means someone with access to the account records in real time. Cole," she said. "Cole is still watching the accounts remotely, through whatever access he built before he left." She stood up. "He built a backdoor into the records. I've been working in those books for 3 weeks, and I didn't look for—" She stopped, breathed. "I didn't look for external access points because I was focused on the entries themselves. I should have looked deeper." "You couldn't have known to look for that," William said. "I should have," she said. She said it without self-pity. It was not self-pity. It was just precise. "Harlan needs to know about the back door," she said. "If we can establish that someone had unauthorized external access to the ranch accounts, it fundamentally changes the nature of the debt claim. It shifts from a civil debt dispute to evidence of deliberate fraud." William was already picking up his hat. "I need to go back to Harlan." "Wait." She held up one hand. "If you ride out twice in one morning, anyone watching the North Road is going to know something has changed. Blackwell will know we've connected to Harlan." He stopped. "So what do we do?" She thought for 3 seconds. It was enough. "Send Hank," she said. "On the supply run. Today, not Thursday. He takes the documentation I prepared for the backdoor access. I'll add to it this afternoon, and he delivers it to Harlan through the hardware store. Harlan has a brother-in-law who owns the hardware store on Mill Street." William stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Harlan mentioned him in the letter he sent you 8 months ago about the Blackwell offer," she said. 3rd paragraph. "He said his brother-in-law had heard rumors about Blackwell's interest in the North Pasture." She paused. "I read all the correspondence, William. Every piece of it." He looked at her for a moment, in a way that she was learning to recognize the specific expression he got when she did something that reorganized his understanding of a situation. "All right," he said. "Hank goes today. What do you need from me?" 3 hours, she said. "And for you to not do anything visible that changes the pattern of your day." He nodded. "And Pete?" "Pete stays inside his normal routine too," she said. "If Blackwell's people are watching, and they see Pete break from his pattern, they'll know he's been discovered. We need Blackwell to believe nothing has changed for as long as we can maintain it." William looked at her steadily. "You've thought all of this through already." "I've been thinking since 2 o'clock this morning," she said simply. "I had a feeling we weren't going to have as much time as we wanted." He crossed to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up at him slightly, and he said quietly, and with a directness she had come to understand was his specific form of intimacy. "When this is over, I'm going to ask you that question again, the one you told me to wait on." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. Then he put his hat on and went to find Hank. And Evelyn turned back to the table and opened her notebook and began writing the fastest, most precise 3 pages of documentation she had ever produced in her life. Hank left for town at noon. He left with the documentation hidden inside the feed supply ledger he always carried, and with instructions delivered so plainly by Evelyn that he had looked at her afterward with an expression that was half admiration and half something like awe and said, "You know, when Mr. Carter said he'd hired a housekeeper, I pictured someone who'd reorganize the pantry." "I reorganized the pantry," she said. "Among other things," he said, and tipped his hat and went. She spent the afternoon doing what she always did, because the household did not pause for crisis, and she would not let it. She made bread. She worked through the afternoon meal, She answered Cody's questions about the supply list without showing any of what was happening beneath the surface of the day. But she was listening. She was always listening. And so she heard the rider before anyone else did. Fast. Coming from the south this time. Not the north road, the south, which was the road from Red Creek. She was in the kitchen doorway when the rider came through the gate, and she recognized him from the station 3 weeks ago. A young man who worked at the telegraph office, who had once handed Thomas Whitaker a message that made Whitaker straighten his collar before he went in to read it. He asked for William Carter. William was already crossing the yard. The boy handed him a telegram. "William, read it." Evelyn watched his face. He read it twice. Then he looked up and found her eyes across the yard, and the expression on his face told her something had shifted, not badly, not yet, but significantly. He walked to her. "Blackwell is coming here," he said. "In person, tomorrow morning." She took the telegram from him and read it. It was brief and courteous, in the way of a man who knew his position was strong and had no need to be anything else. Mr. Whitaker's company had suggested a meeting at the Carter Ranch to discuss the outstanding account matter. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Signed with the studied casualness of a man who expected to be received. Thomas Whitaker's company. She read that part twice. "Whitaker," she said. "He's connected to Blackwell." "Apparently," William said, and his voice was very controlled. She thought about this train station. She thought about the envelope pressed back into her palm. She thought about a man who had looked at her and seen a liability. She thought about the fact that Thomas Whitaker had brought her here, that his rejection was the reason she was standing on this ranch on this day, with 41 pages of documentation that could end Richard Blackwell's scheme. And she felt something so complicated that she couldn't have named it cleanly. Irony was too small a word. Providence was too large a one. "He doesn't know you have documentation," she said. "He doesn't know about Harlan. He thinks he's coming here to present the debt claim to a man with no defense." "Let him think that," William said. He was looking at her steadily. "Until he's sitting in my house." "We need Harlan here," she said. "Or his deputy. Someone with legal authority who can receive a confession or an admission. Because if Blackwell comes here in person and presents the false claim in person, he puts himself in the room," William said. "And we have Pete," she said quietly. "Pete Marsh's testimony plus the documented backdoor access, plus a fraudulent contract claim made in person to the property owner. That's not a debt dispute anymore." She paused. "That's fraud with witnesses." William looked at her for a long moment. "I'll send word to Harlan tonight," he said. Discreetly. "Hank can carry it on his way back from town," she said. "He's not back yet. I'll have the message ready." He nodded. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "Whitaker is going to be in this room tomorrow." "I know," she said again. I know that's William." She said his name firmly, not unkindly. "I am not the woman who got off that train anymore. Whatever Thomas Whitaker represents to me, it is resolved. He doesn't get to be the point of this story." She met his eyes. "You do. This ranch does. That's what matters." He looked at her in the specific way she had come to understand meant he was seeing her clearly all the way through and not flinching at anything he found. "All right," he said. Hank came back at 4 o'clock. He came back with supplies with confirmation from Harlan's brother-in-law that the message had been delivered, and with something else. A piece of information he delivered to Evelyn first, in the kitchen, in a low voice with the door closed. "The hardware man told me something," Hank said. "He said there's been talk in town, about you." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of talk?" "The kind Blackwell starts," Hank said. "People saying you came here under false pretenses, that you attached yourself to Carter Ranch after the thing with Whitaker because you needed money and you saw an opportunity." He paused. "That you're not what you presented yourself to be." She stood very still. She had expected something like this. She had known on some level that the attack would come here, that when Blackwell realized the ranch was not as vulnerable as he'd believed, he would look for the new variable, and he would find her, and he would do what men like Blackwell always do with women who inconvenience them. He would go after her name. "Who's saying it?" she asked. "Different people. Enough that it's spreading." Hank looked uncomfortable. "Some of Whitaker's associates. The women in the mercantile. I heard it from 3 different people before I was done with the supply run. Has William heard? Not from me. She nodded slowly. Don't tell him tonight, she said. He needs to be clear-headed for tomorrow. I'll tell him myself when the time is right. Miss Evelyn. I've been talked about before, she said. I survived it before. Hank looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to say something and wasn't sure he had the right. For what it's worth, he said finally, not a man on this ranch believes a word of it. Something moved through her that she did not let reach her face. Tell them I said thank you, she said. Now go, I have supper to make. She made supper. She made it well, and while she cooked, she let herself feel just for the length of the meal, the full weight of what was being done to her name in town. And then she set it down, the way she set down everything that threatened to take her off task, and she thought about tomorrow. Blackwell was coming. Whitaker was coming. And she was going to be standing in this kitchen when they arrived, because this was her kitchen now in every way that mattered, and she had stopped running from things a long time ago. William came to the kitchen late that night after the ranch was quiet, and he found her at the table in the lamplight, not working for once, just sitting with her coffee and the stillness of the house around her. He sat down across from her without being asked. He looked at her face. He was very good at reading her face. What happened in town? He said. She looked at him. Then she told him. She watched it move through him, the specific journey from stillness to fury, to something controlled and absolute, that was more dangerous than fury, because it had direction. Blackwell, he said. Almost certainly. He's trying to discredit you before tomorrow, William said. So that anything you've documented looks suspect. So that if it comes to a legal proceeding... I know why he's doing it, she said. He doesn't know what you have, William said. He thinks he can undermine you with gossip and walk in here tomorrow with a false debt claim and walk out with a signed paper or a legal foothold. Yes. He's wrong. Yes, she said. He is. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that was beyond protectiveness. Something that was beyond admiration. Something that had finally run out of room inside the careful, measured man he was and was pressing against the surface of him. Evelyn, he said, I need to say something to you. She waited. I've been telling myself for 3 weeks that what I was feeling was gratitude, he said, and respect, and a kind of relief at having someone competent in this house after 2 years of managing everything wrong. He stopped. But that's not what it is. The lamplight held. She did not move. I know what it is, he said, and I'm not going to say anything about it tonight, because tomorrow is too large and too important, and I don't want to... He stopped again. He looked at his hands on the table. I just needed you to know that when all of this is done, when Blackwell is done, and Whitaker is done, and the ranch is safe, I'm going to say it plainly. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said quietly. All right, he repeated, as if she'd given him something. She had. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, William. She listened to him go. She sat alone in the kitchen and she thought about tomorrow, and she thought about the women in the mercantile saying her name like it was something disposable, and she thought about 41 pages of documentation and Pete Marsh's signed account, and Judge Harlan and his deputy, who were at this very moment making their own plans for the morning. She thought about what it meant to fight for something. She had spent her whole life surviving, adapting, making the best of what she was given. She had not understood until this ranch that there was a difference between enduring and fighting. She had not understood that there were things worth standing in front of, not just beside. She picked up her pen. She had one more page to add to the documentation, a summary clear enough to be read aloud in a courtroom written for a judge or a jury who might one day need to understand how one woman reading an old ledger by lamplight had found the thread that unraveled a very large and very patient scheme. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, carefully, precisely, with the full weight of her attention, because this was not just a legal document. This was a record. This was the account of what had happened to Carter Ranch and what had been done to protect it, and she was going to make sure it was accurate and thorough and undeniable and complete. By the time she set down her pen, the lamp had burned low. Tomorrow, she thought. In the morning. She thought about William Carter sitting across from her and saying, "I know what it is," and she allowed herself in the absolute privacy of an empty kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning to feel the full enormity of what those words had meant. Then she put out the lamp and went to her room and lay down on the bed that had become hers, in the house that had become hers in every way except the legal one. And she looked at the Wyoming stars through her window, and she did not feel afraid. She felt ready. Across town in the best room at the Red Creek Hotel, Richard Blackwell was sleeping soundly. He had no reason not to. Tomorrow was going to be straightforward. The debt claim was filed, the pressure was applied, and Carter Ranch was, as far as he knew, a disorganized operation with no legal counsel and no defense, and a distracted owner who had recently complicated matters by bringing home a mail-order bride that nobody wanted. He had built this scheme across 4 years and 6 properties, and he had never once been stopped. He slept well. He would not sleep well again for a very long time. 3 miles north in the kitchen of the ranch that Blackwell believed he was going to own. By this time next month, the lamp had gone out, and the house was quiet, and every single thing that was going to happen tomorrow was already in place. Documented, witnessed, signed, and waiting. Because Evelyn Parker had read an old ledger by lamplight. Because she had noticed a pattern that nobody else had seen. Because a man had handed her an envelope on a train platform 3 weeks ago, and she had pressed it back into his hand. Because William Carter had taken off his hat. The small things. They were always the honest ones. The morning of Richard Blackwell's visit came in cold and clear, and Evelyn was dressed and in the kitchen before 4:30. She did not make an elaborate breakfast. She made a practical one, the kind that sustained people who were about to do something difficult. Biscuits, eggs, strong coffee. The food of people who needed their hands steady and their minds clear. William came in at 5. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said the night before. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him. "Harlan's deputy will arrive at 9, he said. "He'll come in through the supply road. Harlan himself will be in town at the courthouse ready to move the moment we send word. And Pete knows what to do. He'll stay in the bunkhouse until I call for him." William wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "He wrote a second statement last night, more detailed. He gave me the name of Blackwell's man who approached him, the dates of every conversation, the exact instructions he was given about which records to access and when." "That's thorough," she said. "He couldn't sleep," William said. "So he wrote." She understood that. She had not slept much either. But the sleeplessness of someone doing the right thing late was different from the sleeplessness of dread. There was a kind of forward motion to it that felt, if not exactly like peace, then at least like its practical cousin. Cody appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30, hat in hand, with the expression of someone who had decided something. "I want to stay close to the house today," he said. William looked at him. "You've got fence work on the south quarter." "South quarter can wait," Cody said. He said it simply and without apology. "Whatever happens this morning, I want to be here." William looked at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. She gave him nothing. No direction, no signal. This was his household, and his men, and his call to make. "Stay close," William said, "but stay out of sight unless I need you." Cody nodded, satisfied, and went. William watched him go and then turned back to his coffee. "He's 17 years old." He said, not quite to Evelyn, not quite to himself. "He's loyal," she said. "That's not nothing." "No," William agreed. "It isn't." Hank came in at 7, with the specific taut energy of a man keeping himself carefully in check. He sat at the table and drank his coffee without speaking for a full 5 minutes, which for Hank was unusual, and then he looked at Evelyn and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Because what they've been saying in town." "Hank." I know." He set his cup down. "I just want it said that every man on this ranch knows exactly who you are and what you've done here. If Blackwell thinks he can walk in and use some rumor to undermine, he can't," she said. Because I have 42 pages that say exactly who I am and what I found. She looked at him steadily. The rumors are noise, Hank. The documentation is the truth. And in my experience, the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be in the right room at the right time. Hank looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drained it and stood. "Yes, ma'am," he said with a conviction that settled something in the room. At 9 o'clock exactly, Judge Harlan's deputy arrived on the supply road. His name was Davies, a compact, careful man in his 40s, with the quiet professional manner of someone who had sat in on enough legal proceedings to know that the less he said before the critical moment, the more effective he would be when it came. William brought him into the study and closed the door, and Evelyn heard the low rhythm of their voices for 20 minutes before the door opened again. Davies came into the kitchen. He looked at her. He looked at the notebook on the table, the one containing the summary she had written at 2 o'clock in the morning. "Mr. Carter says you built the case," he said. "I documented what I found," she said. "The case built itself." He picked up the notebook. He read the summary page, the one written to be read aloud, clear enough for a judge or a jury. She watched him read it the way she always watched people read things she'd written, looking for the moment they understood what they were holding. It happened on the third paragraph. His eyes stopped moving. Then they went back to the beginning of that paragraph and read it again. He looked up at her. "How long did this take you?" he said. 3 weeks to find it," she said. 2 nights to document it properly." He set the notebook down very carefully, the way you set down something breakable. "Mrs. Parker," he said. "Miss Parker. Miss Parker." He looked at her with the evaluating respect of a man in a legal profession who understood exactly what careful documentation was worth. This is an extraordinary piece of work." "It's accurate," she said. "That's all it needs to be." He nodded slowly. Then he went back to the study, and she went back to the kitchen, and the clock on the mantelpiece moved toward 10 o'clock, with the particular slowness of time when something is coming. They arrived at 5 minutes past 10. She heard them from the kitchen. 2 horses, the sound of the gate voices she didn't recognize, and then one she did. Thomas Whitaker's voice. She had not heard it since the train platform. It was exactly as she remembered, confident, moderate, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms that arranged themselves around him. She did not go to the window. She stayed at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed once slowly, and then she stood up and straightened her dress and walked out to the common room. Richard Blackwell was not what she had imagined. She had built a picture of him in her mind over 3 weeks of studying his schemes, and she had imagined someone larger, somehow more visibly predatory. Instead, he was a man of medium height and medium build, somewhere in his early 60s, with the well-maintained appearance of old money, and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life walked into a room where he wasn't certain he held the advantage. He looked at her once. Not the way Thomas Whitaker had looked at her on the platform, not assessingly, not with calculation about her value. He looked at her the way he probably looked at furniture, registering her presence and assigning her a category employee, irrelevant, and moving on. That was his first mistake. Thomas Whitaker saw her a half-second later and went still. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat. Not hostile, not wounded, just clear. The gaze of someone who had moved past the version of herself that he had rejected and wanted him to know it without a word being spoken. Then she looked away, because he was not the point. "Mr. Carter," Blackwell said, extending his hand to William with the easy warmth of a man who believed this was a social call. "I appreciate you receiving us. I hope we can clear this matter up simply. These account disputes are always more straightforward than they appear." "Sit down," William said. "Not please sit down, just sit down." Blackwell registered the tone. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a slight recalculation. But he sat, and his man sat beside him, and Thomas Whitaker took the chair at the far end, with the look of a man who had just realized the room was arranged differently than he'd expected. William sat across from Blackwell. He did not speak immediately. Evelyn had seen this quality in him before: the willingness to let silence do its work, to let the other person feel the weight of the empty space until they moved to fill it. It was a negotiating skill that came from years of dealing with men who underestimated him because he was quiet. Blackwell moved to fill it. "I'll be direct," he said. "We have documentation of an outstanding supply debt from this ranch to the Consolidated Provision Company. 14 months of billing. The amount is—" "I know the amount," William said. Blackwell paused. "Then you understand the position." "I understand your position," William said. "Yes." Something in his tone made Blackwell recalibrate again, more significantly this time. "I want to be fair about this," Blackwell said. "I have no interest in making this difficult for you, Carter. The simplest resolution, William said, is that you withdraw the claim." Silence. Blackwell looked at him with the expression of a man who has just heard something so unexpected that his face hasn't had time to construct a response. "I'm sorry," he said. "Withdraw the claim," William said. "Today, in writing, before you leave this property." Blackwell looked at his associate, then back at William. Something cold was moving through his expression, now the warmth entirely gone, the professional facade settling into something harder and more honest. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "I don't think you understand the legal situation you're in." "Then let me explain the legal situation you're in," William said, and he looked at Evelyn. She walked to the table, and she set the documentation in front of Richard Blackwell. 42 pages. Clean. Cross-referenced. Organized with the particular precision of a woman who had spent her whole life making things clear that other people had allowed to become confused. Blackwell looked at the stack of papers. Then he looked at her. And this time, he did not look at her like furniture. "This is a complete record of every irregular payment made from the Carter Ranch accounts to the Consolidated Provision Company," she said. Her voice was even. "Including the dates those payments were initiated, the external access points used to authorize them, and the documented connection between those access points and Dennis Cole, who was placed on this property by your organization in December of 1882. Blackwell's face had gone very still. "Additionally," she said, "you'll find a cross-referenced record connecting the Consolidated Provision Company to Blackwell Timber through 3 shell corporations with corporate registration documentation obtained from Laramie County records." She paused. "And behind that, a signed testimony from Peter Marsh, who can detail the specific instructions he received, the dates he received them, the name of your man who delivered those instructions, and the nature of the arrangement you proposed." The room was absolutely silent. Thomas Whitaker had gone pale. Blackwell looked at the documentation for a long moment. He was a man who had built an empire on never showing his hand, and he was working very hard at it now, but she had spent 3 weeks studying the traces he left, and she knew the shape of his thinking, and she watched the moment he understood that what was in front of him was not a bluff. "You have no legal standing to," he started. "Deputy Davies," William said. Davies stepped out of the study doorway. Blackwell stopped speaking. Davies walked to the table. He identified himself quietly, his name, his authority under Judge Harlan's court, and then he said with the practiced calm of a man who had delivered this kind of statement many times, "Mr. Blackwell, Judge Harlan has reviewed the documentation presented here and has issued a summons for your appearance in his court at 2 o'clock this afternoon regarding allegations of fraud, deliberate financial interference, and the filing of a fraudulent debt claim. I'm here to ensure your cooperation." Blackwell looked at Davies. He looked at the documentation. He looked at William. And then for the first time since he walked into the room, he looked at Evelyn. Really looked at her. Not as furniture, not as an irrelevant category, as the person who had done this to him. "Who are you?" he said. And for all the control in his voice, she could hear the thing underneath it, the genuine incomprehension of a man who had planned against a struggling ranch and its distracted owner, and had not at any point accounted for her. "My name is Evelyn Parker," she said. "I manage this household." A silence. "You did all of this," he said, not a question. "I read the account books," she said simply. Everything else followed. He stared at her for a moment that held everything. His fury, his calculation, the specific cold recognition of a man who has lost because he failed to see someone coming. Then he looked at his associate and said very quietly, "Get my lawyer." "Your lawyer is welcome to meet you at the courthouse," Davies said. It took another 20 minutes, the low, controlled negotiation of a man who did not capitulate easily, even when the walls were fully in, but Blackwell finally stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his hat. He looked at William Carter with the expression of a man storing something away for later, the expression of someone who did not forget. William met it without moving. At the door, Blackwell paused. He looked back at Evelyn one more time. She looked at him steadily. No victory in her face. No anger. Just clarity. He left. His associate left. Davies followed them out, moving efficiently to ensure they went where they were supposed to go. And then it was just William and Evelyn and Thomas Whitaker, who had been so quiet throughout the preceding 30 minutes that they had both almost forgotten he was there. He stood up from his chair. He was looking at Evelyn with an expression she had not anticipated. Not hostility, not embarrassment, but something that was, if she was reading it correctly, something close to genuine shame. The specific shame of a man who has watched someone he dismissed prove comprehensively, and in front of witnesses, exactly what he had failed to see in her. "Miss Parker," he said. She waited. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for what I said on the platform, though that too, but for the manner of it, for doing it in public in front of people as though you were a transaction." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care for a man who usually deployed them with such efficiency. "That was wrong. It was beneath both of us, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. She had known that from the beginning. He was a man who had let his priorities arrange themselves in the wrong order, and who had treated a human being as a line item, and who was now standing in the house of the man who had seen her value from 50 feet away on a train platform, looking at the evidence of everything she was capable of. "Thank you," she said. "I accept it." He blinked. He had perhaps expected more heat, more architecture to her response, some form of the scene that the situation seemed to call for. But she had nothing else to give him because she genuinely had no more feelings about Thomas Whitaker that needed expression. He was a chapter that had ended on the station platform in Red Creek, and what had come after was so much larger and so much more important that there was no longer any room for grievance. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He paused at the door. He looked at William. "She's—" He stopped. Tried again. "You're fortunate, Carter." "I know that," William said. Whitaker left. The door closed. And then it was just the two of them standing in the common room of Carter Ranch in the 10 o'clock quiet. And outside, a Wyoming morning was moving forward without ceremony. And somewhere down the road, Richard Blackwell was riding toward a courthouse where Judge Harlan was waiting for him with 42 pages of documentation and a signed testimony, and 3 years of suspicion finally given its proper legal form. William looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. And then she did something she had not done since she stepped off the train in Red Creek, Wyoming, not on the platform, not in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, not through 3 weeks of work and discovery, and a man looking at her across a table and saying, "I know what it is." She let herself feel all of it at once, the fear that had been underneath every day of the last 3 weeks, the loneliness of the years before that, the particular grief of a woman who had given up on the idea that there was a place in the world where her intelligence and her capacity and her heart were not too much, not inconvenient, not something to be managed. She let herself feel it, and she did not try to press it down into a small hard place, and her eyes went bright, and she breathed through it with the deliberate care of someone managing something large. And William crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He took off his hat. "I said I was going to ask you again when this was done," he said. "I remember," she said. "When your 3 months are up." He stopped. "No. Let me say it differently." He looked at her directly with the full, unguarded directness she had come to love in him, the quality she had recognized in a single gesture on a train platform before she even knew his name. "I don't want 3 months, Evelyn. I don't want a household arrangement. I don't want whatever this was supposed to be when I offered it to you on that platform." She was very still. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as my housekeeper. As—" He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words as a rule, and the fact that he was struggling now told her something about the weight he was giving to getting it right. As the person who sees everything I miss, as the woman who pushed that envelope back, as... He stopped again. "William," she said quietly. "Yes." "I already know what you're trying to say," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said, "because I've been watching you for 3 weeks the same way you've been watching me. And because you took your hat off on a train platform before you even knew my name. And because when Pete Marsh told you what he'd done, the first thing you asked was whether his son was safe." She held his gaze. "I know exactly what you're trying to say." "Then tell me your answer," he said. She looked at him. This quiet, careful, deeply decent man who had stepped forward in a crowd when he didn't have to, who had offered her a choice when he could have offered nothing, who had spent 3 weeks watching her build a case that saved his home and looking at her across a kitchen table like she was something he had given up on finding. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer. Yes." He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for longer than he realized. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him. And his hand was warm and sure, and she felt the steadiness of it move through her, the way warmth moves through a cold room slowly from the inside out until it reached every part of her. "You're sure," he said. "William." She looked at him with the clearest eyes she had. "I've been sure since you took your hat off." He almost smiled. The real one. The one that reached his eyes. The one she had seen exactly 4 times in 3 weeks and had been quietly cataloging like something precious. "I should warn you," she said. "I've already reorganized your entire kitchen and overhauled your accounting system and exposed a multi-county fraud scheme. If I stay, I cannot promise to be less than that." "God, I hope not," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the sound of it in this room, the ease of it. She had not laughed like that in longer than she could accurately remember, and it arrived like something returned after a long absence. He looked at her laughing, and something in his face went so entirely unguarded that she felt it like a hand pressed flat against her chest. They stood like that for a moment, her hand in his, the sound of her laugh fading into the warmth of the house, the Wyoming morning moving forward outside. Then she straightened. "We should go to the courthouse," she said. "Harlan may need us to testify." "Yes," he said. He did not let go of her hand. "William." "One more moment," he said. "Please." She let him have it. Outside Red Creek, Wyoming, was going about its ordinary morning. The women in the mercantile were talking about something else now, as women do when the story they've been telling gets overtaken by a larger one. Down at the courthouse judge. Harlan was settling into his chair with the documentation that a woman from Virginia had spent 2 nights writing by lamplight. And somewhere in that building, Richard Blackwell was sitting across from a lawyer who was looking at 42 pages of evidence and saying very quietly that this was going to be difficult. Pete Marsh was in the bunkhouse writing a letter to his son in Texas, telling him that it was going to be all right, that someone had found a way, that he was sorry it had taken so long. Cody was somewhere near the south pasture, pretending to check a fence line, because William had sent him to give them the room, and Cody was 17 years old and wise enough to understand what that meant. Hank was in the yard going about the morning's work, with the particular satisfied efficiency of a man who knows things have moved in the right direction. And on the same train platform, where Evelyn Parker had once stood, with a white-knuckled envelope pressed back into a man's hand, and nowhere to go, and $7 in her purse. A westbound train was pulling in, carrying new passengers and new stories, and the ongoing indifferent motion of the world. She had arrived in this town believing she needed someone to choose her. She had discovered something far more valuable, that she had been choosing herself all along. Every day she had worked before sunrise. Every night she had written by lamplight. Every moment she had seen something that needed doing and simply done it. And she had found in the choosing of herself a man who recognized what that meant, who did not want to diminish it or manage it or return it in a white envelope, who wanted to stand beside it. William Carter had looked at her across 50 feet of train platform and stepped forward when every other person stood still. Not because she needed saving, because he had seen her clearly, fully, without reduction, and had understood in the wordless way that the most important things are understood, that this was a woman worth moving for. A person's value is never decided by the people who fail to see it. It is recognized clearly, immediately, and without condition by the one person who was always meant to, and William Carter had recognized Evelyn Parker from the very beginning before she left town, before she had any reason to believe this place held anything for her at all. He had taken off his hat, and everything that mattered had started right there.